Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys, and today we're going to talk about wildlife photography using subjects that are a little bit smaller in frame. And I think you're going to find this one really interesting, so stay tuned. We'll be back right after this. Hey everyone, in today's video, we're going to talk about small in frame photography for wildlife. Now, I'm a bird photographer. You're going to get a lot of bird images. I tried to sneak a couple mammals in here as well. The concept around this video, I tried to break it down into segments. So we're going to talk about minimalism. We're going to talk about light and color a little bit, isolation and how to use isolation to make small in frame photography work. We're also going to talk about habitat and how you can use small in frame photography or smaller subjects to really accentuate the environment or the habitat and to include them in it. And then I'm going to show you a couple other kind of random images at the end that tie in. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into this layout today. And you're looking at my Flickr page. I'll put the information for my Flickr down there. I also want to tell you that in today's video, I'm really excited because I got to add some of my patrons into this video. So I've got a bunch of images. I'm going to highlight them. I'll put their contact information down below. So if you want to follow them on social media, you can do that. And of course, I want to give them credit for their images. So you'll see their names down below. Now, I tried to break this video out a little bit more sequential or try to have some pattern or logic to it. And I wanted to start this small in frame conversation around minimalism. One of the things that's interesting with small in frame photography is it gives you an opportunity to be very, very simple and to highlight a couple things. Now, for me, minimalism isn't just about making it small. I like to accentuate color in this process. You can do this with black and white. So this could be a black and white image. It could be a completely white background with just a small silhouette. And I've seen that style out there, and it can be done very, very effectively. That would be truly minimalistic, just a small silhouette in a much larger context. Now, I tend to use color, so I like to highlight sky. So in this case, I've got a snow goose on a really pretty sky, and I got another set of snow geese. Might have even been from the same day because the sky was so magic this night. I still remember it. And I really wanted to accentuate the sky. So instead of focusing on the subject, I wanted to include the great colors here. One of the things that's interesting about using a smaller in scale subject is it can be very artistic. I did a video on the archetypes of bird photographers or wildlife photographers in general. And I talked about this concept of having technicians and artists. And to me, artists tend to be more comfortable with this small in frame concept. We're not really worried about details and identification or key features of a subject. We're not really worried about feathers for birds. What we are really worried about is just creating a really pretty image that might look really nice on a wall. Now, that's not to say you can't do portraits that look well, but let me just kind of show you an illustration. I took a snow goose several years ago that looked like this. And at the time, I thought this was a pretty snow goose. I wouldn't put this on my wall. It's just not very flattering. So when you look at the difference between this small in frame set of snow geese versus this, much tighter kind of in-flight action shot, this shot may do fine in a magazine telling a story, documenting snow geese, something like that, but it's not really artistic. When you get into these small in frames, very minimalist approaches, it can be very, very powerful. Now, this image is by Brian Nelson, and I thought it was a really nice job of just creating a scene that's very easy on the eyes. So when you look at this, very small in scale, and I told you for me, if I were to break this into about 5 rows or 5 or 6 columns, that subject would occupy about one of those columns. Again, there's no real rule for this. You just kind of know it if you see it. And I think this one does a really nice job of illustrating minimalism. Here's another one. I'm going to start to introduce this concept of color and how you can use small in frame subjects to really accentuate certain colors. Now, I did that with those pinks and blues. This image by Michael Darmstadt is a really great illustration of the use of those golden tones. So the image is much less about the subject. And this image is really just about a color highlighted by this wonderful silhouette. Here's a couple. I told you I'd try to sneak in a couple here. This is one of my images from a few years ago where I just had this deer isolated on this cliff, and I thought it was a really pretty scene. So just kind of taking in a larger environment and context. And then this one, a really nice one by Brett Sams. And I'm going to use this one to transition a little bit. And you're going to see me transition from this concept of color and minimalism into this concept of isolation. So notice where this bird is on the branch. Really pretty stuff in the fog. These foggy images, by the way, I'll throw a couple tips in here as I go. Fog works really, really well for backlit images. Really, really well for backlit images. Let me transition to kind of more traditional frontlit photography. And I'm going to notice a series. Now this is a tree swallow that I took a couple years ago. This is a flycatcher I took a couple years ago. And you can just see that they're at the top of perches, really, really clean in terms of the backgrounds, not a lot to compete with it. So in that minimalist type of approach, putting those subjects way at the top of the frame can be really, or way at the top of the perch can be a really interesting way to play around with this. Got a couple more images here. This one's by Greg Lisiak, a European photographer that I worked with for the last couple years. Really, really nice job. Again, notice the birds at the top of the perch, and we're including a nice non-competing background. So the bird really, really stands out. Now there's different approaches. So small in frame is not a one size fits all. I'm going to show you later on some birds in environment and in habitat. But for this series, I wanted to show you birds that I thought really, really stood out. A little bit more habitat here, but again, bird at the top of the perch. This one by Mark Troxel. This looks like a marsh wren. Really, really well done. Here's one by Jason Jablonski. Looks like is that a long spur? My bird photography fans are going to get angry when I can't identify these birds. Is it a Savannah sparrow? I'm just going to move on. This is one that I did. This is a common yellow throat that I thought stood out really, really well. Kind of minimalistic, but starting to focus a little bit more now on composition. So you could see that just that one leading line, that branch that comes through the frame, but isolated on the background. Not really anything competing strongly with it. This is a Nashville warbler that I took a couple years ago. Again, notice the focus on composition. So the subject isn't the predominant part of the image. It really is a complete image that focuses on composition with the subjects isolated. So again, we're talking about isolation of subjects. Here's a Louisiana water thrush that I took a couple years ago, started to introduce a little bit into the background. But again, it's not really competing with the subject. It's allowing the subject to really stand out and be isolated. This is one by Dan Gertzman. I liked this composition quite a bit. Talked about leading lines and angles. You could see how that cut branch, that cut stump leads right down to the bird. Now, I know a couple people out there are going to say like, ooh, compositionally, like he's too close to the edge of the frame. There's a some rules or some guidelines for composition, and they are all meant to be broken. So while in general, I like more space out in front of the bird, in this scene, it creates what you would call tension. So you've got a more of an angled, like a sharp angle with this bird pressed a little bit closer into the right side of the frame. And these images actually do create different emotions. So I'm not going to get into a whole thing about composition, but just know that I would probably lump this into the category of an image that would create a little bit of tension and has kind of an angular feel to it. So nice job, Dan. I liked that one a lot. Now this is one I did getting back to isolation and composition. Again, you're going to see very simple perch, simple subject, little bit of interest in the background, not really competing with it, but just trying to complement it. And I just wanted to take a break here and talk about, where you're at in terms of your comfort level and why bother with this whole concept of small in frame. Like, Scott, it's not a style I like. I want to take bird pictures close up. I like to fill the frame. I want to get detail. You've got, if you want to experiment a little bit, you're going to have to push yourself out of that mindset. You're not going to get feather details when you're small in frame. That's really not the point. You may not get all of the key little features and nuances of your subjects. What you can do, though, is create these really compelling images that may tell a bigger story or may work much better as artwork. Now, if I took a really tight shot of a hooded warbler, that's what this subject is here, and I just filled the frame with it, it may create some oohs and ahs, like feather detail, really cool, you got so close to the subject. Probably not something I would ever put on my wall. And in fact, when I look around in my office, I look around in my basement down here, which I've kind of laid out with a lot of bird pictures. I wouldn't say all my bird pictures. 50% of them are small in frame. Now, I do have some that are portraits that I really liked for any reason. But one of the things that I like in my own personal work, in my portfolio, if somebody were to kind of browse my gallery on social media or on my website, is I like to create different looks. I don't want to be lumped into just one type of photographer. So for some photographers, you've got a style. And there's nothing wrong with creating a uniform style. So I create a consistent look through my gallery, a consistent look through my website, and that's fine. And it could be small in frame. I know a couple photographers that really enjoy this. And if you looked through their work, you would see a pattern of a lot of small in frame work. I know others that like to do a lot, and I would in fact argue that most bird photographers prefer tight portraits. And so you may create a gallery of just tight portraits, and that's a style. I like to break mine up. I actually do enjoy both. And when looking through that, I think for me personally, it just creates a lot of diversity in my portfolio. I make this joke about a yearbook for bird photographers. Some galleries literally just look like headshot, 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 headshot. It's almost like looking through an old high school yearbook where you just see headshot after headshot after headshot. Everybody's a different species, but they all kind of have the same vibe. I don't like that look personally in my gallery. I do like to mix it up. But again, that's not a judgment. There's no right or wrong. And in fact, some of the most successful photographers simply stick with a style that is consistent and works for them. If you're early in the process, experiment. And that's really what I try to do with a lot of these videos, is just encourage experimentation, show you some things that maybe you're not doing, maybe well done. I hope mine are well done, and that you look at these and say, yeah, that's really neat. I'd like to try to replicate that. And one of the great things about this is you can use a shorter lens. You don't need those super 500 and 600 millimeter lens to achieve this. I'll show you one or two images here in a minute, taking it like 200 millimeters. You don't need that long lens all the time, and you don't need to feel the pressure to be right on top of a bird. What you do need to do often is look through the frame. And I paused on this intentionally because I had a very cooperative bird here. I was not very close to it. It was just on this branch singing. And I had the ability really to compose in frame. So I was able to move the bird off to the right. I was able to keep my distance and not feel any pressure to get close. I knew I had this really interesting pops of color in the background. And these were emerging spring leaves in the background that were just catching some light. And in frame, I was able to get that whole branch in. So it really, for me, it was a really great exercise in composition in the field. And I didn't feel any pressure to get closer. I just felt like this was a great scene, and why not take advantage of it? So I think there are huge benefits to this small in frame style of photography, but it often does take an ability to look through the frame and see what you're dealing with in a bigger context. So now I want to talk a little bit about the use of light. Now, first series I talked about was minimalism, just very small, but kind of stands out well in the frame, whether it's a silhouette or using colors. I also wanted to talk about isolation, which is that other set of images kind of on perches. Sometimes at the top of perch works really, really well. Not a lot of competing backgrounds, but just kind of isolating the subject and allowing for a really pretty image. The focus there often on pretty backgrounds that have a little bit of interest in terms of color, but aren't necessarily competing with the subject. And I want to change focus to light a little bit and how you can use light to also highlight your subject. So if it's not isolated per se, how you can use light. And in this image, I just intentionally took what was there. So I had a little bit more light hitting this part of the frame, the top right, a little bit less on the left. And I decided to enhance that when I edit it by burning the left a little bit more and enhancing the right. And for me, it allowed that subject to just really stand out. But the light, notice that little leading line of light that kind of brings you down to the bird. So anyway, I liked that image. I thought I would include it here, but I had a couple others that I wanted to show you. Now notice we're not getting isolation in this image. This is Ryan Sheen, wonderful image of a puffin on cliffs. But the use of light here is really exceptional because he's isolated this puffin, not because it stood out from the background, but because it actually was highlighted by the light that was there. If you look, and it's not just in Photoshop dodging and burning, you could probably tell there's a little bit of that going on here. But if you look right down here, you're going to see a dark shadow, and then you're going to see light actually hitting the front of the puffin, a little bit on this cliff, and up in here. So it really just happened. It's a really nice image. I'd love to think it was intentional in the field. I'm not the photographer, so I can't get into his mind, but I think it's an excellent illustration of how you can isolate a subject that's small in frame by using light. Let me show you a couple more. Some songbirds. Notice the background in shade back here and this little trailing light that brings you right up to this bird. And this is Marilyn. I'll put her Instagram handle down there. She goes by My Feathered World. But a really pretty image, small in frame, not isolated from the background, part of the context, not necessarily telling a story of habitat or environment, but notice the use of light, how the use of light isolates that. Some of this is done in Photoshop, and I teach a lot of this on my Patreon channel, but just a really nice way to make those subjects stand out. A couple more very similar. Now this one is really small in frame. almost as small in frame as you could get. Notice it's not just isolated like the other ones, but watch the light right here. All of the light in this image comes from this background here, and then it trails down along this branch. And if you were just looking at this quickly, you probably wouldn't find it. In fact, if the image had an even brightness across it, if the luminance was even across the image, the subject would really have a tough time standing out. But your eye, just kind of notice how your eye kind of is drawn to this area of the image and it finds the bird. And then you're kind of like, oh, that's cool. So tiny in frame. This is a Eurasian blue tit, and this is by Cohen Jacobs. Focus on composition. So sometimes these small in frame images can really lend well to giving you an opportunity as a photographer to highlight composition. And notice that real gently curved branch with the goldfish. This is Toby Cantrell. This is one that I did that I really liked. I wouldn't call it tiny in frame, it's smaller in frame, but again, an opportunity to highlight. You're gonna see me start transitioning to environment a little bit more. So to highlight not just the subject, but show it against a really interesting perch for me. This was against some Rose Bay rhododendron. That's a native plant that grows here. Another one that I took, a chestnut-sided warbler, starting to focus a little bit more now on composition. Notice how he's kind of framed in those leaves. I believe that's an ash tree, a young ash sapling that he's perched at the top of a mountain, singing at the top of a mountain. Really, really fun day for me up there. Focus on composition. Here, smaller in frame, but notice how it's part of a bigger story. And look at the leading line created by this yellow. This is compositionally, this is probably one of my favorite images that I've taken in the last year. I just loved the fact that the yellow leaves created a leading line that literally curved right into the curve of this area. It's really fun when you talk about composition. Composition is a very personal thing. I think it's always interesting when someone can talk about their own compositions, the intent behind them, why they like them, what it is about an image that I like. And this is an image I like talking about because it does to me, to me, this is a very pretty image. And I try to be humble on my channel, but I am also proud of stuff that I take. This is one that I'm very proud compositionally of because these curves tend to be very pleasing to me. And I just love the way that yellow on the throat and on the breast is completed in that curve by the sunflower. So that's a pretty image to me. Talked about shorter focal lengths. This is a 200 millimeter lens that just allowed me an ability to tell a story in this sunflower field. So probably the same subject in the same field that I was shooting, but gave me an opportunity to switch lenses and play around with different focal lengths. So here you can see very small in frame, but again, I think a pretty image, and the bird stands out. It's well isolated, but it's part of a bigger picture. It's context. There's more to it than just the isolation. This one's by John Alessi. And again, in terms of composition, I thought this was really well done. He's got the bird isolated very nicely here. This main branch, or the trunk of the tree, really complements this branch here, and he falls into a very nice area there. So nice job, John. This is Derek Chenot is a terrific photographer. He's been with me for a long time on Patreon. Really, really well done. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about habitat and the inclusion of habitat. Shorter focal length. Let me creep down here because I don't know. He's got this at 200 millimeters. I wanted to be sure that I give you that because, again, I told you, one of the advantages of these smaller in frame images is you don't need these long lenses all the time. So I thought this was a really, really powerful image, wonderfully done, great composition, got foreground, subjects isolated, but you're starting to get a feel for habitat. So now you start to feel like this is where these birds belong. Nikki Nobles with an amazing image here. It's a little common yellowthroat on pokeweed. Absolutely love this. Very well done. It's a native plant, so you know I love that. Nikki also a native plant enthusiast. Really, really beautiful. Starting to introduce a little bit more. So notice it's not just isolated at the top of a perch on a blank background, but it still stands out. It's an easy to identify subject, and it's part of this whole story. So the composition on this, the environment is just gorgeous. Here's another one. Talk about like in the habitat, in the environment, telling a story. Love this one. This is by Cami Freed. Beautiful image, lovely colors in the background. Looks like a swamp sparrow up there. And you really get a sense that they're in it. So not isolating it like we did in the beginning, now starting to include it, but still have it stand out so that it doesn't get buried or lost in the photo. Really great one again in terms of minimalism. I could have probably put this up in the minimalist category, a little high key, super composition, but I wanted to include it in this, and this is Andrew Sonia. I wanted to get this in here under habitat because you do get a sense that this is where the bird belongs, but it doesn't get lost in it. It still stands out really, really nicely. This is one that I did. I'll move a little quicker now as we get into some of these small in frame habitat shots. That's my pokeweed shot. There's a little field sparrow in there, but notice all of the subjects, even though they're in this larger context, even though there's a lot of habitat, the subjects are relatively easy to find. They still stand out nicely. So to me, that's one of the tips around this small in frames is, can you get your subject easy to identify and still stand out and not just get buried in it, even when they're in habitat, even when you're telling a story about backgrounds. Very similar to the ones we just showed you. This is Barb Wart Blank. Beautiful habitat. And look at how well isolated the bird is. So the bird is really isolated, but we still have this gorgeous scene full of habitat, full of wildflowers. These, I believe, are all native plants as well. So just absolutely love this one. Really, really nice job from Barb there. And I wanted to show you just, it doesn't, smaller in frame doesn't always have to be songbirds on sticks. I mean, here we've got a raptor flying, a little bit smaller in frame. It's actually the background for this video that I put up there. I just noticed that. Talked about isolation and minimalism. So here, this bufflehead stands out really, really nicely. I think it's got a very small in frame, but easy to identify aspect to it. I really like that when it's small in frame, but it's, for me as a bird photographer, I can quickly identify the subject and I still see hints of those key attributes. And for buffleheads, it's this iridescent head here. So just a little bit of that. And some of those colors mirrored in the background as well. In terms of habitat and backgrounds, this is a nice context. You see the sky, it's got compositionally, it's got some layers to it. Looks like a little horned grebe in winter. Another horned grebe. Wanted to show just some variety in these smaller in frame images. You don't have to get super tight to make it work. And then I think I end on this one because this one contained a lot of the same elements. This is shot backlit. You see the habitat, so you can identify these evergreens in the background. Stands out. The light helps find it. So you notice this little light kind of all leads you down to the bird. Doesn't get lost in there. This edit took me a while till I got it comfortable with it. It was just out of camera. It didn't look like this. I'll be honest with you. Not digitally manipulated so much as it was just getting the light right and making sure it felt natural without bringing up the duck too much, without burning the background too much. So a lot of playing around with this one, but I really liked how this looked. And I'm going to close on this one. Smaller in frame, easy to identify the subject, isolated, the light really plays into it, and in an image that I like. So that's what I got for you today. Small in frame photography. Couple tips to think about. And just think about how the progression of this went. Don't be afraid of minimalism. It may feel awkward at first, but give it a try, especially if you're a newer photographer, and it's something to definitely experiment with. Can you get your subject just really, really isolated, either on a plain or simple background, or can you add color to that? Kind of like an art field print. Look at the image that I've got. Let's see, it's this one over here in my background. I put that there for a reason. It's an art print. I showed it in this small in frame presentation today. It literally is just colorful and nice and pretty. Doesn't even matter what the subjects are. They're snow geese, but it doesn't matter. So think about that minimalism. Think about isolation. Can you isolate the subject really, really well, make it stand out, possibly at the top of a perch? Background might be a little bit cleaner or at least not distracting. Can you use small in frame and combine it with light so that these little trailing areas of light help you identify where that bird is in the frame? I showed you that warbler in one of the evergreens and how it was in the habitat, but the light really just helped trail to it. So can you use light to identify and help isolate? And then habitat. How do you make a small in frame bird fit into a habitat that kind of tells a story? This is where the bird lives. This is where the bird feeds. And how can you make that really pretty and make it stand out? So it can be tough. Those images can be really, really tough sometimes to get the bird isolated and stand out with all of that context. But I showed you a couple of really great examples, I think, where you can do that. And then finally, it doesn't have to be songbirds. It can be, I showed you deer. It can be whatever it wants to be. Sometimes silhouettes can work really, really well for this. So don't be afraid to go out and shoot into the sun, like that last image of the duck that I showed you, kind of shooting back into the sun. You can get a lot of neat effects that way, keeping the subject small. And I think it's really, really pretty way to shoot. So anyway, that's what I've got for you today. Small in frame photography. I hope you enjoyed it. Where are you at in your journey? Down in the comments, let me know. Do you like this style? Have you tried it before? Is it your go-to? Or is it something you want to do a little bit more of? So let me know down in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into this video. I always appreciate your support, and let's continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.